Welcome back, guys. Hope you are well. Quick announcement right off the top here. So I'm going to move to 2 videos per month instead of weekly. So bi-monthly instead of weekly. I'm not sure if I will stay on this for like long term, but over the fall here, there's a lot of kind of family events going on, people move in and stuff like that. And it's just going to work out a lot better for me if I can just go to bi-monthly for the time being. So I hope you understand. I'm not going anywhere or anything like that. Just decreasing that frequency a little bit. All right. But the Q&A this week, the first question comes from Jane or Janie. And, you know, I'm definitely going to, I'm shortening this question, but essentially the premise of the question, I believe, and let me know in the comments if this isn't answering what you're getting at, but basically can't fit all of the potential volume that they need in order to reach their kind of MAV or their MRV with the time that they have to train. So what to kind of do in this situation when, you know, you can physically recover from more volume. You just don't necessarily have that time to train. And I think that this is a situation to where you really start to look at prioritizing certain muscle groups. And I think that that's the biggest thing. So what do I mean by that? Well, really taking a hard look at, hey, are there certain muscle groups that you don't care as much about? For me personally, I don't care as much about my legs at this point. Like, I always train my legs pretty hard for sports and stuff like that. And really, like, if my legs don't grow much the rest of my life, I'm actually kind of cool with that. So with that context, for me, right now I'm willing to give about 6 hours to the gym a week. And if I want to train my upper body up to its kind of MRV, then within those 6 hours, it would be really tough if I also wanted to do that for my lower body. So that means that my lower body, you know, I'm not necessarily keeping it at maintenance, but I'm keeping it at the kind of very bottom end of what I think is probably effective, kind of that MEV range for my lower body. And that's the same thing that I would recommend for you. I would say, hey, for the muscle groups that you want to prioritize the most, let's train those up to their MRV. For the muscle groups that are maybe secondary priority, okay, we'll still accumulate some volume, but not go crazy with it. And then muscle groups you care less about or third priority, then maybe we're looking at maintenance or kind of MEV throughout your entire muscle cycle. And, you know, there's people that don't scale volume at all and still grow really, really well. So even for those muscle groups, I think that you can still see some really solid growth, but maybe just pushing those other muscles that are most important to you more. All right. So that's how I would structure that. And just a specific example, maybe your delts and your biceps are most important to you. And I'm picking those because those are like the 2 areas that I want to particularly grow the most, getting those delts. And because I have to look better for these videos. And for that, maybe you train your biceps and your delts up to 16 to 20 sets per week, but maybe your hamstrings and your quads aren't as important to you. So you keep those maybe around 10 sets per week. And then maybe for your chest and back, like maybe they're kind of secondary priority. So maybe you start around 10 sets for those and then go up to maybe 14 or 15 sets. When you know that you probably could train those up to upper teens, but you just don't necessarily have the time capacity for that. All right. And if you're particularly short on time, non-impeding muscle supersets are a kind of huge time saver to where, like, if I still want to get in some trap training or some forearm training or auxiliary stuff like that, then I will superset biceps with traps, or biceps, maybe not biceps with traps because you're still getting like some tug on your biceps when you do shrugs and stuff. So maybe like biceps with calves or delts with, I was going to say delts with traps, but that also wouldn't be a good idea because when you're doing lateral raises, you're working those traps a little bit. So maybe calves with traps or something like that. But you get my point. Chest and back, biceps, triceps. Non-impeding supersets can be a really good way to get that volume in an effective manner. All right. So I hope that helps out there. Second question here, controversial one. What do I think about deadlifts for hypertrophy? And this is something that, the guys talked about, Stephen Pascal, on their Improvement Season podcast this week. And my thoughts align with theirs quite a bit here. And, it's not that I think that deadlifts are a bad movement for hypertrophy. I think that if you could only go to the gym and do one movement for the rest of your life, it might be a good call to pick deadlifts because you get some quads, you get some hamstrings, some glutes, some back, some traps, some biceps. I can't make an argument for chested triceps, but other than that, you get a lot with deadlifts. However, they definitely do come with a cost of systemic fatigue, and it's important to consider that if your goal for the deadlifts is, say it's to grow your hamstrings, well, could you, what's the opportunity cost of what you could have done in that deadlifts place instead of deadlifts for your hamstrings? Well, you could have done RDLs, and RDLs are probably just stimulative for the hamstrings and glutes and potentially less systemically fatiguing. And then if you're using deadlifts kind of for your back, well, would a barbell row be a little bit more stimulative and less systemically fatiguing? Maybe. But then again, maybe on the deadlift, maybe you get a combination of training your back and your hamstrings. So you just have to do one set instead of two sets of an RDL and a back. So I probably lean more towards the side of, I think deadlifts are actually pretty okay in a hypertrophy program, and you can get some good traps, some upper back, and some hamstrings and glutes kind of all in one exercise, maybe instead of separating those out. And then maybe the systemic fatigue from those isn't that much different. So I probably am a little closer to that end than like what Stephen Pascal might be. But I also think that for a lot of people, especially if they don't know how to deadlift or the deadlift is particularly fatiguing for them, then a better route is probably just the RDL and the barbell row. But if someone knows how to deadlift well, then I still think that it can be a solid movement and you can definitely build some mass with it. So I don't know. I kind of think it's like, do what you want. It's probably not going to be a big deal if you choose to do a couple of sets of deadlifts rather than a couple of sets of RDLs. At the end of the day, I think that both can kind of lead you down the same path. Now, I think that people start getting in trouble with it if they start doing like really heavy singles on the deadlift and just doing a lot of volume with the deadlift. I would be careful in particular with the total volume you do, but I don't know, if you're doing a few sets of deadlifts per week, I really don't think it's going to be harmful to your gains. And I think that you're probably going to be fine there. All right. So consider the opportunity cost of what exercise you could have done in a certain lift's place. And this applies to more exercises than just deadlifts. And I think that all roads can kind of lead to the same place as long as you manage that training stress and stuff like that. And personally, I really like the deadlift. I like performing the deadlift just because my ego likes doing it. So I still keep them in here now and then throughout a macro cycle. And when I do that, I really don't think that it affects my systemic fatigue a ton. Now, I also have quite long arms and I might be particularly well structured in a way for deadlifts. So that's kind of my personal context there. But just consider the fatigue cost that comes with them and whether certain exercises might be a better tool for hypertrophy for you. All right. Especially if you're short on time, because deadlifts can take a while to kind of get warmed up to and stuff like that. To whereas an RDL, it's like, man, I do a couple of sets with just a single plate and my hamstrings are ready to go. So good on that. Next one, more or less exercise variation. So I've definitely touched on this one in the past, but kind of the TLDR is I generally like about 2 to 5 sets per exercise. And I kind of like this because it's kind of a nice middle ground to where it's like, okay, if you're doing 1 set for every exercise, well, you're going to be switching exercises so much and you're never going to be able to take advantage of having kind of a novel stimulus of doing a new exercise because you're doing them all every single kind of mesocycle. And when you're also switching, it's just practically you're moving around in the gym a lot, using a lot of different equipment, and there's a good chance that you're not going to be able to access that equipment because there's going to be people using it and stuff like that. And you might have to warm up differently for different movements. And it's just practically doesn't tend to work out well. Like, could you do it and still see good gains? Probably. But I just think practically it makes a lot more sense to stay in that middle ground. And could you do more than 5 sets per exercise? Yeah, I think that you could. But I think that 2 to 5 range, it's a good kind of middle ground to where if you do so many sets for a single exercise, well, you might be kind of training a muscle through less of a variety of kind of angles and lines of pull and stuff like that, which could influence hypertrophy to some degree. So I think that at least having some variance in there is a good idea. And just kind of mentally doing like 6 or 7 sets of back squats, like that is definitely a lot. And I find personally that after about 4 or 5 sets for a single exercise, I'm like, okay, I'm ready to kind of move on here. So I think that 2 to 5 sets per exercise is kind of a nice middle ground. And whether you land more on the 5 set end or the 2 set end, I really don't think it's going to be a big deal either way. All right. So good on that. And the final question here is when to do a primer phase versus an active rest. So a primer phase, the way I'll define it is a period of lower volume, maintenance training, maintenance dieting, to where you're doing lower volumes, maybe working in more strength rep ranges and that sort of thing. To whereas an active rest phase, to me, is more like kind of a double deload, to where you deload normally for your first week, and then that second week, it's either just another deload or you just take that week off, or it's a really light deload. And I think that the active rest phase almost achieves exactly what you want to achieve during a primer phase. As a primer phase, your goal is to really drop that systemic fatigue you might have accumulated across multiple mesocycles and maybe increase your psychological kind of drive to do hypertrophy training again and just kind of give you a little break. And I think an active rest does that well. And I think active rest, you probably get a similar kind of resensitization effect with just 2 weeks of not doing much compared to a primer phase, which is probably like 3 to 5 weeks. So I lean towards doing active rest phases a little bit more. Now, when would you choose the primer over it? Well, I think that particularly after a fat loss phase and you've accumulated quite a bit of diet fatigue, then I think I would go the primer phase route and having an entire mesocycle of, hey, let's just maintain here. Let's drop this diet fatigue. Let's put us in a good place to start gaining again. That's when I would like a primer phase. So after more of a kind of standard or extended cut. Also, I just think a primer phase every once in a while still might be a good idea for potentially the effects of working in kind of the strength rep ranges every once in a while. I think that there could be stuff going on at the fiber type level that may be a good idea and potentiate future hypertrophy. So maybe a good flow would be you do 3 or 4 hypertrophy mesocycles, then an active rest phase, and then 3 or 4 more hypertrophy phases, and then another active rest. And then after your next 3 or 4, then you do a complete kind of primer phase, lower volume phase. And this is also assuming that you're on a permabulk like me and a lot of my clients, to where basically it's just kind of gaining phases. But if you have if you have a standard cut mixed in there, then I think a primer phase after that cut is a good idea. All right. So across like a year and a half of training, you might be looking at 2 or 3 active rest phases, just 2 weeks of lower volumes, and then maybe 1 kind of primer phase. All right. So maybe across say you do a 12-month gaining phase. Well, maybe every 3 to 6 mesocycles throughout that gaining phase, you have an active rest phase. And then after that gaining phase, then maybe you have a couple mesocycles of fat loss. And then maybe after that, then you do the primer, rinse, repeat. I think that would be a nice kind of logical setup there. All right. So I hope that kind of gives you some insight in how I think about that for clients and stuff like that. But that's all I got this week. I will see you in 2 weeks. Talk to you then. All right. See you guys.